Hi everyone, thanks for downloading this very special Christmas episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. Just a quick reminder, Chris and I are doing a live podcast recording at the Barbican Centre in London, discussing the wonder of nature in the works of Studio Ghibli. This is going to tie in with the RSC's current live production of My Neighbor Totoro, which Chris and I had the pleasure of seeing a few weeks ago, and spoiler alert, it's great. So if you haven't managed to get tickets for that, because they've sold out fast, why not come down and listen to us talk about Ghibli more broadly, thinking about how nature is explored in their works and celebrated, and also touching on issues sort of sustainability and how animation can be a force for good in that battle. So we'd love to see you down there. Mulled wine probably will be available. If not, I'm going to go find it somewhere and join us in the bar afterwards, perhaps for a drink. Tickets are available on Barbican website, and the event is on the 22nd of December at 5 p.m. Barbican.org.uk, barbican.org.uk, and just search Fantasy Animation and you'll find us. Otherwise, enjoy the show. Hello listeners, Merry Christmas and welcome to this festive episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris. It's definitely not still November holiday.
I wondered how quickly you'd be ready to jump in and point out that this isn't Christmas yet, Chris. You do it every year, the resident Scrooge of the podcast. Yep. I like to pretend when we're basking in sunshine that it's Halloween, Easter, Christmas, and you like to destroy the illusion. But that's why I'm the fantasist and you're the tech guy.
Sure.
We're doing the Snowman on this festive occasion. The Channel 4 classic animation from the early 1980s. It's got a lot of fun stuff to think about in terms of Christmas iconography, the fantasy of Christmas. You know, we get to dance with Father Christmas, make snowmen, they come to life. So there's plenty for me to chat about this week, Chris. As an animation, what might listeners be interested in looking for?
So I have notes on compositional looseness, I guess the kind of painterly style of the film, even though it's not sort of painted in the traditional sense, the sort of the etching, the drawing, the sort of materiality of the images as they stand out. And also what struck me, I was going to say this time watching it, but I will confess and say the first time watching it, is a sort of distinction between inside and outside space and how fantasy moves between those two spaces. So I've actually got a little bit of fantasy to talk about this week.
Listeners playing the festive edition of the Fantasy Animation drink-along game already have to tick off boxes on Chris corrects Alex and Chris confesses to not watching a movie that he would expect people to have seen. Yep. So we're already racking up the points.
Yep.
Great. Well, we're joined this episode by a very special guest, Dr. James Walters, who is a reader in film and television studies in the Department of Film and Creative Writing at the University of Birmingham. James's research kind of hovers around two different areas but overlapping at the same time. He is an expert in screen fantasy, and I'm very familiar and often cite on this podcast indeed.
This is true.
Works on fantasy, alternative worlds in Hollywood cinema, and fantasy film. Two terrific books on, and two important works in sort of adapting theories of fantasy conceived elsewhere into the cinema. And then he's also got an extremely broad range of research projects on television, including a book coming up on repetition and television that will be forthcoming. And so if listeners are listening far in the future, at a different Christmas from now, do make sure that exists and access it. We'll talk more about that later in the podcast, but for now, James, welcome to the Fantasy Animation Podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. So, we're going to do The Snowman. I know this is a film that you have been thinking about quite a lot recently. There'll be a blog in a few days on our own website about it. So, The Snowman, it seems to overlap with a few areas of concern within your research, but I wondered if you could talk about what got you interested in thinking about The Snowman and why others might be interested in it.
Well, I mean, I suppose I got interested in thinking about it this year because it's the 40th anniversary of it, which I hadn't actually spotted. And then I just sort of, did my basic maths and realised that actually it was coming up. And the author of the original book, Raymond Briggs, passed away this year as well. So that kind of brought it to mind. And then it was just a lot of the things that we look at the moment are big. It occurred to me, if you want to write about film franchises, you're talking about many, many films. And there's almost this slight challenge of what you need to know anything about anything anymore. And because I write about television as well, same kind of thing really, that you're talking about this big span of text when you're getting into it. And the Snowman really appealed because it's small, it's short, it's this little anomaly really in Channel 4's history, which we can talk about, that just sort of pops in there right at the beginning and then sticks around and gets shown every single year.
Smallness is an interesting adjective to use, actually, because I'm grateful having recording this podcast in the middle of a always packed university term. It's nice to watch something in preparation that's 24 minutes long. So there's an issue just of duration that I accept as small. There's an issue of visuals. The film is, what might you describe it as? Cosy, quaint. It's got lots of adjectives we throw at it. But I'm not sure. Epic and grand is what it's going for. Put it that way. So, to give listeners who perhaps international listeners a bit of context, this is a film, a television, a short, whatever we call it, a short animation that is shown pretty much every Christmas on Channel 4, one of the state's, at least partly state-owned broadcasters here in the UK, and it's this kind of institution, right? It's one of those Christmas viewing checklists. Did you watch The Great Escape, whatever was on BBC One at 4:00 on Christmas Day, and did you catch The Snowman? And usually I end up watching it sort of slightly inebriated after stumbling home from the pub on Christmas Eve and that sort of thing. So why do you think the film has developed that kind of following here in the UK?
Well, I think there's those things that you started off by saying, this idea of kind of quaintness and coziness. It's a film that was made in 1982, but already has a feel of the past about it, even when it's released in 1982. The interior looks slightly older than the 80s setting. And so it already has this kind of Christmas nostalgia built into it. Christmas wasn't a feature of Raymond Briggs' original story. It got introduced when it was adapted for television. So it kind of has that aura around it before we start. It's also, this shortness can be quite deceptive. It can hide achievement. It can hide the kind of the technical craft in something like The Snowman, but it also makes it quite an easy watch at Christmas as well. I think the stumbling home drunk from the pub scenario is not uncommon, or having frazzled parents sitting their children in front of something as they're desperately trying to wrap presents. It kind of fits a bill there. And again, it doesn't really rely on knowing anything else. You don't need to bring anything to it. You can watch it as a standalone, fleeting experience as part of the Christmas build-up and kind of leave it in its place. So it's one of those weird texts that's familiar and almost unobtrusive and almost invisible. And I think that can actually be quite misleading because it can make us not look at it and not appreciate really the work and the technique that's gone into something like The Snowman.
Yeah. Yeah, its 1982ness, I think, is important for a couple of reasons. Actually, it hadn't quite clicked until you were saying, James, about its sort of smallness or this sort of relationship that has to Channel 4. So the first reason that 1982 is interesting is that there's a bunch of films that straddle fantasy animation that we've already looked at on the podcast that came out that year. So Tron, The Dark Crystal, we can add to that Blade Runner, The Beastmaster, and Star Trek: Wrath of Khan, and all of these films are footnotes in a really important history of effects technology and animation, and so this already feels like the smaller version of all of these big narratives, these grand narratives. Actually, artistically, Alex is looking at me in a way that I'm gone. Then,
well, no, we'll come back to this, but I actually was struck by
watching it this time, and maybe it's because for reasons only I will hold right now, I've been watching quite a lot of the original Superman movie over the last kind of couple of months, and I was struck by, yes, it does have this quaintness, it does have this small scaleness to it, but at the same time, some of the filmmaking grammar on display here, some of the stylistic choices are extremely operatic, grand, and actually kind of have a nod to that late 70s, early 80s photorealist spectacle of, I didn't think we'd be comparing it to the Beastmaster straight out the bat, but actually it's not completely inappropriate.
Yeah, I definitely have a few notes. It's a lot more mobile. The film is a lot more mobile than I thought it would be. It definitely doesn't walk in the air. It, pretty much hurtles through all of these different spaces, and the role of sort of point of view, if we can kind of call it that, because you have point of view shots during the film, but then right at the start, the camera takes you through all of this landscape. This really, it's detailed, but it's also, it keeps a foot in the realm of the hand drawn. So I sort of get what you mean, that maybe there's a potential tension between form and content, or even the styles of the film, which maybe the hand drawnness of it, or the painterly, or the visible marks on the paper, the mark making that one can see in the film, actually hides some of its grandiose or more grandiose properties potentially. Yeah. So we could talk about that. The other thing, it's 1982ness, is actually going back to the Van Norris's work on British television animation, and he organises the work of Channel 4 into a series of phases. And the first phase is, or waves he calls, first, second, and then third wave. So the first wave of British animation on television is 1955 to 1978. So it's about what he terms an era of new adaptability and pragmatism. Animation is a kind of functional medium, and you often find it in information cartoons and sort of more propaganda, he says. And then we move into the second wave, which is 1979 to 1996. So this isn't that far into that second wave, and he talks a lot about Aardman, but he also talks about Joanna Quinn and the Quay brothers. So the second wave was a flourishing period that he says was a corrective to the fragmented era of the first wave. Here we have new beginnings, a real acceptance, he says, of animation as a really viable art form, and then at the heart of this viability was a growing industry and cultural acceptance that animation was more than just a medium for children. So that really struck me, that this is right at the start of this second wave of which, Aardman is perhaps one of the key players if we think about what Ard was doing in Creature Comforts, but also the earlier Wallace and Gromit. And so this, I just thought it was interesting that this comes right at the start of a second wave. So again, has a kind of importance to the history of British animation that is sketched by Van Norris, who I know you know well, Alex, but this sort of, this...
My esteemed colleague.
Yes. So that trajectory, I think, is really important to try and insert that film, or this film, into that lineage.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite inspirational. It's funny you should mention Aardman, because Nick Park cites it as something that was inspirational for Wallace and Gromit. The style of Raymond Briggs. The Snowman's included in that, but there's other of Raymond Briggs's books that were kind of an inspiration for that. And you can see the Britishness of the mise en scène of these sorts of British animations, the way in which they start in living rooms, in kitchens, in small spaces, and then suddenly explode out and sort of soar out into a whole different space, and also a different set of narrative potentials, fictional world potentials as we think of them, and this expansion. And I think that the Snowman is an early archetype of that, of that idea that you locate it within something that is small, domestic, but also British. I mean, that list that you mentioned, Chris, of all the other films, I think they're all US films. That are the fantasy. I was going to say genre, but then we'll get into a whole other thing.
Let's not go there just yet. Yeah.
But this sort of, how do you have an alternative to that type of fantasy cinema? Was it Dark Crystal and Blade Runner that have technical accomplishments of a particular kind and are wonderful and have this epic scale to them and are really detailed and really, wonderful films. The texture and the detail of something like The Snowman, with its hand-drawn style, places it not only kind of nationally within a different context, but also stylistically within a different tradition. It takes us back to a tradition of animation, but of drawing, of kind of graphic tradition that those other films perhaps don't.
Yeah, and that's also has been understood by writers such as Paul Wells, kind of connecting the domestic and the hand drawn to gender. This is what he terms a feminine aesthetic, and let's not forget, this is not to say that this is directed by a woman and so forth. People writing on filmmakers like Lottie Reiniger, I know Caroline Ruddle has written on Reiniger in relation to craft and the gendered element of hand drawn. There's something a feminine aesthetic that is often attributed to that level of, or that craft-based, let's say, aesthetic, the hand-drawn, the domestic, the tabletop, Lottie Reiniger working outside a recognised studio system, working at home and creating and crafting these animated pieces. There was something of that flavour, and it hadn't twigged, and I realised that this is Dianne Jackson, who directed and adapted it from Briggs's novel.
And it's not just, Dianne Jackson does direct it, but you've also got Hilary Aldous and Joanna Harrison, who are the lead animators. And they're doing a lot of the work adapting Raymond Briggs's visuals into this. And they come up with a lot of the ideas as well. So they come up with the idea of the motorbike, and I think they come up with the idea of Father Christmas. And it's interesting what you're saying about gender, that we've got a female director of this film, but we've also got a strong female team that are really leading the creative side of it. So I think the point that you're making is absolutely true in this case.
Yeah.
Why don't we unpack the 24 minutes of it? We could do it in real time this episode.
You could watch along. People could watch along. There we go.
But to start with, because we better get into the story of the beginning, because the version I watched slightly hastily yesterday on YouTube has a kind of slightly interesting live action sequence with a sort of person walking through the woods saying, sort of reminiscing about that time he built the snowman. My understanding is that there's another version of that beginning, and it features David Bowie.
That's the one I watched.
Features David Bowie. We better talk about. So, James, do you want to tell us what happened here and where what the story of that beginning is?
Okay, so the voice that you heard, Alex, in your version is Raymond Briggs. So he was the original guy at the start, and I think the shot of that sort of lonely man walking into the distance is also Raymond Briggs as well. So that's what originally was the broadcast kind of introduction, and then the film gets picked up by the American market because Raymond Briggs's book had an American release, so it has a market there. At which stage they say, Raymond Briggs is not going to sell this. We need somebody. We need somebody that doesn't look like they're walking to
Tesco.
And so they look around and they say it needs to be a rock star. It needs to be somebody with rock star status. So David Bowie is the person they turn to. Now, as it happens, Bowie is a fan of Raymond Briggs's work and has an affection for it. And so he comes on board quite readily, doesn't take a fee. The only payment that he received is the scarf that he wears in the introduction, which is rather charming, which he takes home to his son. And so he steps in. And it's one of these kind of peculiar moments. Oh, there is actually, before I talk about the peculiar moment, there is a third version, which I think is in the 90s. Mel Smith, the comedian, voiced Father Christmas. And so a new animation was created to go on the beginning of The Snowman, featuring this Father Christmas character. And that ran for a little while. And then Bowie comes back, and he's the one ever since. So it's kind of a peculiar moment, but Bowie had loads of peculiar moments in the 80s. I mean, it's just... I think it's about 1984 that Bowie does his introduction, which absolutely fits with what Bowie was kind of doing at the time. And it is one of those odd moments, but it's Bowie sort of taking it seriously. And I think one of the really charming things about the Bowie introduction is the sincerity with which he delivers that opening. And it works. It actually is, a good piece of film there.
There's a project out there, isn't there, that probably either already exists and I've not read it, and therefore I apologise to whoever wrote it, or needs to be written about kind of stardom and the sort of fantastical energy and things like that. Because with Bowie in particular, Bowie is, this oddly throughout his career, right? He's fantastical. He's constantly kind of creating these personas that are kind of sci-fi fantasy reflections, and then we have Labyrinth. So it doesn't feel surprising that he was associated with the project.
But apparently, Raymond Briggs, he was introduced to Raymond Briggs and said, really charmingly, "I'm a very big fan of your work." To which Raymond Briggs, this slightly grumpy man that Raymond Briggs was, replies, "I wish I could say the same." And it's sort of like, it's heartbreaking,
And it's interesting that this movie, watching it again, actually has quite a lot of whimsical, comedic set pieces in a way that I'd forgotten about. Because the set pieces that have really resonated with people, I think, are the more melancholic, serious sections of the movie, and it goes right to this kind of opening section where we get this kind of, we talked about traveling shots. I'm fascinated by the use of well, I wrote down point of view, but I don't know whose point of view it is. But there's this shot that kind of recurs throughout the film, and we get it right in the opening sequence, where the camera itself almost kind of takes an agency like role in the story, and we get this kind of really great gliding tracking shot down into the house where these cartoon graphic picture book images are given depth and vitality. And again, this is what I mean about Superman. It feels like those shots from Superman where he's kind of flying at the camera and the space. There's depth and there's energy, and the world feels like it's kind of traveling past the camera, albeit a kind of faux camera. And the film is very invested in this idea of making a picture book come to life, right? And that's kind of part of its strength.
I think that a lot of that comes from the original picture book itself,
Sure,
and the way in which Briggs managed to evoke movement within the line drawings and the pencil drawings, which they were very keen to do. You're absolutely right about that opening shot. I think it sets up an aesthetic expectation of movement within the film. That this is a film in which we're going to be almost constantly kind of on the go. There's this impetus and this drive that's created within there, which is really interesting because in some ways it's a very kind of stable, very calm environment that we're brought into. And a lot of that movement derives from the character of the Snowman. Everything he touches kind of, there's some bit of play, there's some bit of movement that goes on. He can't walk past a pineapple without making it into a nose and all this kind of stuff. And all of that then sets up, I think, the impact of the loss of movement, that final point in the film where things stop moving. And it's really interesting that the film almost goes to it does go to a still image at the end, and then the camera pulls out and we have the movement away. And so in order to make that moment matter, I think not only do you have to have the narrative connection, you have to have narrative events that connect you with the characters. A snowman melting has to mean something to you and also to the central character. But also in terms of as an aesthetic experience, having that kind of fluidity of movement that sort of penetrates through all of the sequences, to have that stop and to have the potential for that to stop so suddenly and so unexpectedly actually has a kind of aesthetic impact as a viewer, as well as this kind of narrative shock that people feel at the end of the film.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, movement. It's all about movement. It's about a snowman coming to life. Could we say this is about animation? And if you are going to say that, let's tick off another box on the Christmas bingo list.
Yes, it's like our version of an advent calendar. where you just look behind the door and there's me going, it's all about animation.
Making a mental note to do that for next year.
So I had obviously mobility through the animated space. Later on in the film, I think it is anchored to particular characters, especially the sort of motorcycle sequence where they chase a fox and it sort of moves quite rapidly through the woods. So at some point you get quite specific POV shots, but I think James is right, setting up an expectation at the start that movement will play a key role, but also de-animation and lack of movement will play a key role in this. It also, for me, connects the film quite directly and deliberately to childhood, because the child protagonist spends a lot of the first 5 minutes of the film watching and observing and rewatching and looking out the window and returning to bed and then looking again, and the expectation of movement by a character in the film towards a character that he has created. So I wrote down, essentially, this boy is constructing. I mean, there's moments where he just plays in the snow, making footsteps, picking up a snowball, throwing it at the kitchen window, and then almost immediately starts to construct a body. So we have child as modeler, child as, I was going to say animator, but actually it's almost like child as character designer. So it's that I found really interesting, that it is about animation, but actually quite specifically it's about the design of, a fatherly figure. The father doesn't play. You see the mother, but the father doesn't seem to play that much of a role. And this maybe links into conversations we'll have later on about gender, about the role that this snowman is playing in relation to gender and performance and some of the sort of things that the snowman does. So I think movement is really important.
Absolutely. And the sort of, you get a sense of the tactile nature of the modelling that's going on as well. And it's a relatively, it's a 24-minute film. It's a relatively long sequence within that duration of the making. And so it commits time to that. As you were sort of describing that, Chris, it made me think there's something about movement and childhood going on here as well, especially at Christmas time, this constant activity that children generate. And it occurred to me that most of the time we're seeing the parents, they're quite still. They're sitting every time almost, or standing very still, whereas
sleeping in bed, or
they are the world's heaviest sleepers. Actually, an actual motorbike starts up and they don't stir at all. But that image of them asleep in bed, they're kind of is very consistent with how they're represented, whereas the little boy is always on the go, always on the move, and so this expectation of him looking out at the window, almost as though he's going to imbue this snowman with his own activity.
But just by looking at him, there's a sort of a willingness, a transfer of energy. I was thinking about the division then that I mentioned at the start between our inside and outside space. So inside is watching, is order, and it's routine. It's brushing teeth. It's getting ready for bed. It's routine. It's order. Outside is sort of chaos, freedom, and movement. And it struck me that when the snowman first comes alive, the child brings the snowman in rather than the child running out. And I thought that was an intriguing move that I don't know what I mean by this, but I don't know what it means. But bringing the snowman in to sort of disrupt this world.
Well, you might say we're getting all the rhetorics on display here. So we're getting a moment. The episode.
Look at you, fantasy bods. Look at you go.
But we're getting the first episode where the snowman's brought in is an intrusive rhetoric, right? Fantasy comes into the known and the familiar, and it makes things familiar unfamiliar again. Because as James was saying, the snowman delights in picking up objects and turning them into other objects, or not knowing what the objects are, or making the space that is familiar strange, right? That's what that first kind of episodic, playful episode is about bringing this creature of magic into a non-magical space and making that space magical kind of by proxy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me a bit of E.T., which is released.
Same year, 82, is it? We did this on the show a few episodes ago.
I'm not sure. I shouldn't just throw in things as tests.
No, it's all right.
For
That
you.
means I get to Google it. 82, yeah.
Which has a similar thing where Elliot's bringing E.T. into the house, and E.T. obviously drinks the beer, and it all goes wrong. But it's exactly what you're describing there, Chris, of sort of bringing it into the familiar realm. I think also it's slightly I think there's an affinity that is created between the boy and the snowman. I think there's something quite interesting, almost Frankenstein's monster-like about creating this being. But what he's doing is creating a playmate with some of his own characteristics, movement, playfulness, all of these things. So bringing him into the house makes absolute sense. Come into my environment and see what we can do here. How can we transform all of these dull elements that we have in this domestic environment? How can we transform them into something that's playful and that's something that's, far more engaging and far more animated than it was previously?
Does this mean that the snowman is... And I was trying to think this through when I was watching it. Is the snowman making up for a lack in the boy's life?
Well, there's a fraternal aspect to the relationship, I would say. Like, it's quite acute that the child seems to be an only, unless I've missed something, there seems to be an only child, right?
Yeah.
I think that fraternal's sort of more in line, and I think the reason is that the parents aren't absent. There's nothing wrong with the parents.
No.
I mean, there's a temptation to see everything through a kind of Harry Potter lens of, well, what's the neglect that's being countered here? And I don't think there is. I think it's more. It makes me think of the Wizard of Oz a little bit more, actually. That everyone kind of ignores Dorothy, but they're not bad. They're just busy. It's the similar thing here. Actually, the mother's caring. She makes sure that he's sort of got a hat, and there's a nice bit where she helps him put his pajamas on before bed, and you think that's quite a good detail to put in, actually, because it just shows that there isn't something that needs correcting here.
Yeah.
The only thing that the snowman's bringing is company that is on the boy's level, that's sort of in the same realm of imagination that the boy is occupying at that stage of childhood. And so the idea that he constructs a playmate kind of in his own image, and I think that the film is using some mirroring at times when the boy has built the snowman and is standing looking at him. The boy's standing still, the snowman's looking still. There's this shot that isn't really necessary, but what it does show is that it's sort of, yes, I've built something for myself that is like myself as well, and it will have that affinity as a result. And of course they do everything together from that point on.
Interesting. So we get this sequence in the house, and then they come out of the house and start playing again in the snow, and we have the nominal snowball fight, which we were all waiting for, and is indeed included. We get some more shots of moving cameras and depth, and the snow kind of gumming back and forth in the depths of the frame. And it occurred to me that snow's a really great... It's one of those, it's like water or fire or these kind of elemental forces that work really well with animation, because it's almost like, and indeed with childhood, right? And that why are kids so excited when it snows? Well, it's because the whole world becomes this almost like drawing box, right? You can write messages on things that you couldn't write messages from. You can build creatures out of ornaments. You can have snowball bites where you can take an element, bring it together, make a missile, throw it, and then it instantly dissipates and goes away again. That kind of ephemeral quality to it. So I think there's something about that as well, right? The snow comes to life. It's not just the snowman that comes to life. The snow comes to life in that sequence and throughout. So that we get another kind of, I guess, level of enchantment. We've enchanted the house, and now we've enchanted the kind of atmosphere around it. So yeah, that struck me.
Yeah, it's funny how the film does use snow, because there's those moments where snow kind of falls and it has this quality of animation to it. It's actually moving. But there's lots of times where snow's being used to kind of accentuate stillness and calmness. And it's interesting when you were saying about water and fire, and it made me think, well, you can kind of do more with those elements in animation to a degree, because they can have a sort of narrative danger. They can have something to them. Whereas a lot of it is settled snow. And this idea that snow is being used to create a different, an alternative world, a
good title for a book. Great title for a book.
But that creates a landscape that is a nighttime landscape, doesn't have people in it when they're going over the fields that suddenly look strange. The shots where they're on the motorbike and they're going through the trees, and it suddenly looks like a kind of almost a haunted wood aesthetic to it. And you think, well, yeah, that does kind of fit. Everything changes at night, but particularly when you have that snow. If you've ever opened the curtains and looked out at the snow and it's fallen at night, and everything just looks very, very different.
Yeah, I really like that idea of snow as this enchanting force. As you said, snow creates a blank canvas and sort of the conditions for creativity and animation. I guess that becomes a real counterpoint to, just to take us back inside momentarily, this where the child brings the snowman inside first of all to engage in the question of routine. So the snowman puts false teeth in, brushes teeth, and there's a few other things: television, teeth, dress up, and then dance. And I was thinking, these are really interesting things, almost like the child or the boy is trying to enculture or socialize this snowman. And I thought that was a really interesting. The decisions one makes to sort of, what would if a snowman came to life, what are the things that I would teach a snowman right off the bat, or introduce the snowman to? And I thought that was a really, and then the danger of fire when the boy realizes that they need to move away. This isn't Frozen in the way that snow is created and used as part of this spectacle of creative flurry. And many people have written about the snow of Frozen in relation to gender and creativity and kind of queerness, actually, also for the block. So it's not convincing snow in that sense, but it's absolutely convincing in the way that it taps into the immediate need for creating with it. And that's what I really liked about the film. Even if it pulls back from the visuals in terms of, this is not I'm not going to accidentally think this is a photographic or photorealist film. There is something absolutely believable and truthful and authentic about child's proximity to snow as this creative possible space of enchantment. So I really like that about the film, the energy that seemed to bustle in all of the scenes of creativity that were filtered through this child, that then repeat through these shots of these point of view shots, whatever we end up kind of calling them.
We've mentioned the motorcycle, but that sequence kind of has a lot of what you're saying there, Chris, and you, James. So maybe we will breeze past that, because it leads us to if the most memorable sequence, and I was about to say the standout moment, but I think that it is full of these great little episodes. But the one that is is certainly the most well-remembered bit of the film, which I don't know, we'll call it the walking in the air sequence, for want of a better term, but it's obviously this moment where we get the song sung on the soundtrack. And actually, if we could talk about the soundtrack, that would be great, because I think that's another strength of this movie. So we get the sequence. They fly to the North Pole, but during that flight, the film kind of almost pauses on this kind of really vast montage of or this, I don't know, what is it? A sequence where the snowman and the child fly over the hills of England and Sussex, it seems like, right, from what I'm reading. James, unpack it for us, because I mean, it's such a beloved sequence in kind of British film television culture that it seems hard to even know where to start with it. So why don't you start, and we'll see where we can go with it.
Well, yes, Sussex, correct. I think it is Sussex. I think Brighton is.
Yeah, there's a pavilion in it, right?
Yeah. And I think montage is absolutely right, not just in terms of time, but also the visual quality of it. This idea that there is an overlaying of different landscapes, different features. It has that feel of montage to it. There's this accumulation of visual spectacle. And I think that the film prepares us for this moment through the mobility of the camera that we've talked about already. But there is a really striking bit of animation when they're running and then they take off. And you mentioned earlier, Alex, about the Superman comparison. But there is something about, even within a film like Superman or the Snowman, that has already established its credentials as magical things can happen here. That moment at which something takes flight is a magical moment, and the film The Snowman seems to realise that is going to be the point at which the audience will be taking off with the visuals, and so it really emphasizes that. And I think that montage quality that we're talking about is, how do you create texture and movement once you've had that moment of taking off? What do you do next? And I think the film is quite intelligent in the way it introduces different aspects, narrative aspects, but visual aspects as well. So you've got water as a contrast to snow. We talked quite a bit about the visual quality of snow. Well, then it brings in water, and what can you do with water? Well, you can put a whale in it, and then you can create movement there. You can have the cruise ship, which looks like quite a bleak cruise ship that's just going around the British Isles, sort of on Christmas Eve. But you can have that sort of different perspective. We talked about point of view. What would it look like for somebody to see these figures sailing through the air? So we have the girl looking out of her bedroom window. Then we have the drunk chap on the ship who's wondering what's in his wine bottle. So it's shifting us around the spectacle of flight rather than simply keeping us with the figures flying. And I think spatially, that's such a clever move on the part of the film to give that sort of texture and impetus to something that might get quite boring and repetitive after a while.
Yeah, but isn't, on that note of kind of shift, I love the idea of kind of taking off with the image. The film also shifts our relationship to fantasy, because you talked about that little detail at the start to have the mum show him how to put pajamas on. And that's really important, because that allows us to not have to qualify the fantasy as this remedy to something that is missing or absent in the same way as we might do, as you said, the Harry Potter narrative. But also the detail of having that reveller, that incredulous reveller looking at the fantasy, also does, in terms of, you were saying about rhetorics of fantasy, Alex, it's also doing something else. And the boy seems to expect fantasy to happen. And I'm trying to think through, the boy expects fantasy to happen, whether that's because he's a child or that's just a childish desire to want things to come to life. It's your Andy in the Toy Story again, versus the reveller who is supposed to be, fantasy is something that adults look at differently. I don't know. It's just a way that the film moves us around the fantasy that I was struck by.
No, but it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like the rest of the sequences have this whimsy and joy and play to it. This one, it might just be the music, has a bittersweet, melancholic. There's something reflective about the walking in the air sequence that doesn't feel the same as the rest of the movie, and it's a real struggle to work out what it is, because even the song itself is articulating magic and something that's supposedly joyous or sublime, but it's doing it in a way that also feels, I guess, fleeting. It feels ephemeral. It feels like as we're enjoying this, it'll soon. I mean, like the snowman itself, enjoy it while it lasts, because it'll soon be gone. Almost. I struggle with it, but there is something kind of melancholic almost about that sequence.
Well, there absolutely is. I mean, let's talk about the music a little bit then. Yeah. So Howard Blake, the Walking in the Air theme, the tune. He had it already. It was something that he wrote. I think he split up with somebody and wrote this bit of music, and then realised that it would fit. It's in a minor key mostly. There is the middle section that takes us into the major, but really it's a minor key composition, and so it has that kind of tone that you're describing. And it's also, as you say, mourning something almost as it's happening, which is an unusual, slightly unsettling position for a viewer to be in. I think also it kind of taps into the sensation of what it would be like to be sort of going through the air with a snowman. There is a kind of... The film attaches a kind of peril to a lot of the adventure and the fun that's going on at the same time. That there is this kind of wonderment, but there's also this slight fearfulness that's going on there as well. And so the music seems to tonally fit that very well. it also seems to capture the scale of the visual spectacle that we have at this point in the film. And I mean, it's an extraordinary soundtrack, really, in that respect. The extent to which Howard Blake keeps pace with the visuals and evokes a mood within the film is astonishing. And as I was watching it again, it really reminded me. I don't know if you've ever seen a silent movie screening with a live pianist, and which is sort of how Howard Blake composed it. Watching it and composing as he goes along, and just how skillful they are at evoking mood as they're kind of watching it. And Howard Blake seems to be doing a similar thing. He understands something about the film, but I think also understands something about childhood. That childhood and childhood fantasy isn't necessarily just about happy, skippy, wonderful adventure. That there's an unease and an unsettling quality to it, and the transience, the fleetingness of fantasy in childhood as well.
I was thinking about the role of these reaction shots, because I suppose there's a way of reading the film where it was all a dream and it was just something that the child really wanted to, and a lot of the film is from the child's perspective, or at the very least the child and the snowman's perspective, not just through these point of view shots, but in terms of the way that they motivate the action and the scenes and the action within scenes. So these little moments of reaction almost tell us that fantasy exists, that fantasy is existing in this space. And that point about access, James, that adults are outside of this. They're not going to understand. They're not going to understand this messiness of fantasy in relation to children. So, yeah, those little reaction shots seem to tell us something. Yeah, tell us something about how this register of fantasy, or this rhetoric of fantasy.
I was reading just on the standard stuff that's out there, the Wikipedia articles and everything, that the way it's presented was that Howard Blake was the one that came up with the idea of having it's the film being without vocals and it being silent and being an orchestra throughout. Do we know, is that the accurate way round, or is that something that they had in mind from the start? Because it's also important to note that this is a silent movie in the inaccurate way that films were silent. Like it's a film without dialogue with an orchestral accompaniment.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that it was Howard Blake's suggestion that it should be a wordless musical score, except, of course, for the flying sequence, which has the vocals in it. I think that a lot of that, well, it comes from Howard Blake, but also it's suggested in the form of the original Raymond Briggs book, which is wordless as well. And it sort of stands out as a rare moment of television in that respect, and it's quite unusual to see anything on television that doesn't have words. And particularly as television is often talked about as a medium for the distracted viewer, there's often a heavy emphasis that's placed on words and the audio quality of television. It was related to radio for a long time for that reason. And so again, maybe when we were thinking about, why is this thing endured? It may be that you literally have to sit down and watch it to follow the story. At the same time, it really is an audio-visual experience because of Howard Blake's scoring. And although there aren't vocals to it, there is a voice to the music that's really interesting. That there is a personality to each of the little vignettes of music that we have with the different sequences, that he manages to very quickly and very accurately pinpoint the tone and mood of a sequence and create a musical score that has that voice to it, that is actually narrating. Music as narration in this film, I think, is really key.
I know that there was a sequel to this, right, 10 years ago, The Snowman and the Snow Dog, and it wasn't quite as well received, probably just because it didn't capture the same moment. But I do think one of the striking differences is that one uses a much more modern soundtrack, right, and has like a pop song, sort of pop artists writing electronic, and I think it's quite interesting to do that. But traditionally, one of the kind of conventions of fantasy scoring is this idea of relying on the orchestra. Maybe perhaps it links back to kind of opera or theatrical traditions, or I'm thinking of like Wagner and like the Ring Cycle or something. I know I'm clutching at straws here, but there is definitely that kind of association, right, of the orchestra as the announcer of magic sonically, in a way that a guitar seems too modern and too of this world to be able to do that, as opposed to a string or a violin or
If only Bowie had done the score.
I'd watch it. Watch it. Absolutely. Yeah. Bowie's version of Walking the Air. Oh yeah, the final thing to clear up, of course, I'm sure everyone both knows the hypocritical version and the real version by now, but we should establish Aled Jones did not do the singing on this. I actually have forgotten the choir boy's name. Let me find it on the internet.
I think it's Peter Orty, is it?
Peter Orty, thank you. Yeah, thanks, James. So just to give the credit there, Aled Jones covered it a few years later. Anyway, so the final sequence of the film, which I always forget about, but it's odd that we always forget about it because it's perhaps the most fantastical sequence of the film. They arrive in the North Pole, and we do get Father Christmas, and we do get dancing other snowmen and Scottish snowmen in kilts, and all manner of hijinks ensues. Do we have anything to say about the final sequence, or is it? I'm the only thing I have to say is that I find it odd that I don't remember it all the time. It would seem like that's the film, right? That's the bit the kids all wait for. But I think it's almost a testament to the skill of those earlier, more domestic scenes that the film actually seems more resonant when it's making the domestic magical than kind of taking us to this otherworldly, completely, enchanted space.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be that thing of the boy introduces the snowman to his culture, and then the snowman introduces the boy to his culture, and this is the conventions that we follow. These are this is what we do every year, and we all gather and we have this this dance effectively in this party, and so there's a kind of charm to what's going on there. But there's also that striking contrast between Christmas in the boys' home, which is quite they sit and watch the television at night and have a very settled, normal family existence that's still, the stillness again. Whereas the snowman's Christmas is exactly what you'd expect the snowman to do, which is to have even more movement and activity. He can't exist in the boys' house without making everything move. And so it makes absolute sense that when all the snowmen get together, the thing that they will do is to fill the frame with movement. And that whole sequence is kind of an assault of different snowmen bodies circling and intertwining and coming in and out of the frame. And it really works as a narrative culmination. I think you need it. He needs to go there and something needs to happen before he meets Father Christmas, which we'll probably talk about. But also visually, it has to kind of fulfill an expectation that the film has been building up. So it seems natural to me that that's what will happen, even if it's slightly weird.
Well, as Chris says on the final point, snow melts,
it does.
and that's what we get at the end of the movie. This image of a very unexpected. Well, it's not unexpected. Where else is this going? But the way it's delivered is quite abrupt. There's and you mentioned this earlier, James, right? There's a shock factor to that ending that does feel quite abrasively like sudden and sad. We don't get the "oh my god, he's melting, what a world" moment. We get "oh my god, he's gone," and before we even knew he might go, before even the threat was introduced, it's already happened. And then the film kind of ends, and this still sad image.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things in that. The sequence the next morning it repeats the same visuals and the same music, I think, to the previous day. So it builds up an expectation of something else. And then there is a very sharp cut, I think, to him opening the door and his reaction. And then we're really quickly into him standing by the pile of snow. And it's that thing of not like when snowmen melt, it happens gradually. If you've ever made a snowman, it kind of,
drawing out the trauma.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking that, like, when Chris was saying that, as part of the game, right? Part of the game is you build the snowman, and then every morning you open up the curtain and you look how if it's still surviving. The other thing is the snowman goes last, not first. The snow goes first, then the snowman. But hey, I shan't quibble.
I think this is a big continuity issue with the end of it. Actually, there's still. I mean, whether the father went out and just threw a load of boiling water over this snowman.
That'll teach him to muck around with my motorbike. Yeah, absolutely. But also the film itself loses animation, because you mentioned this earlier, James, that we then revert to a still image, which certainly in cell animation or hand-drawn animation, let's say hand-drawn technique, is often the reserve of background. Backgrounds are still, characters move, and here you have the whole. You have everything. Everything is de-animated, so the film itself loses its animation. So I thought that was really striking, and again, as a counter, sets up that expectation of movement at the start, and then pulls it away from you and the boy at the end. Cool.
Yeah, and we have this the Walking in the Air theme comes back as a piano version at the end, and what you were saying earlier, it was Alex, actually, about the mournful quality of that piece of music. Its use in the flying sequence anticipates this ending, so it's absolutely appropriate that it should come back at the end when he is genuinely kind of feeling that remorse at the loss. So there's kind of a nice continuity in the music there.
Yeah.
Do we have any final thoughts on the Snowman? I mean, I think we've managed to speak about it for about twice the length of the thing itself, which is. So well done, academics. We've ruined it again. But any final thoughts we haven't covered that are important that we mention?
Well, I mean, you mentioned that there is this sequel, which there is a. It did have a sort of mixed reaction, and there is this sort of tendency for everything to be kind of criticised that is a version of something else in some ways. I think it's interesting, if we are going to look critically at that later sort of film, that how close it does stay to the original. And musically, it is different. It seems very much lighter, very much more kind of pop song oriented to me. But also, it stays with the white male lead. I don't mean the snowman. I mean the boy. It was quite surprising to me at the time, and is still surprising and a bit sort of disappointing, really, that there was an opportunity to actually do something different, to have a different type of central character in there. Not a white character or not a male character. Not only because that might be quite an important thing to do, but also genuinely, I think that would have been an interesting thing to explore. How can Christmas mean different things to different types of children? How can fantasy mean something interesting to different groups? And sort of visually and aesthetically, I think it would have given something new. And it really does surprise me, because of all the places you could probably do that, I kind of think Channel 4 would be the most progressive environment. And I'd be really surprised if there wasn't a conversation in 2012 about that. It sort of jars a bit with me that it stuck so closely to that, but I don't know.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? I guess that one of the things that perhaps is the issue of nostalgia. Once a text becomes nostalgic, it becomes hermetically sealed, right? And there's this, it's like the fan reaction that, very visceral and very obnoxious, in certain sections of fandom about all this kind of stuff. You can't have black people in Star Wars. You can't have ethnically diverse casts in Lord of the Rings. Like,
Jesus, this Little Mermaid.
Exactly. Exactly.
What next? Black people? Yeah.
Has the world gone mad with some mermaids?
Yeah. I know. So I think you're right. There's perhaps some sort of, once a text becomes sacred, it becomes less, or there's a resistance out there to tinker with it, and actually it's almost like that's when you need to make these cases the most, and it's almost the safest place to do it. So it's very lamentable that perhaps that wasn't an opportunity unexplored there. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we're about out of time, and people have presents to wrap, I'm sure. So we'll wrap up. But James, so your book, you've got a book on television and repetition that's coming out, forthcoming. People might be listening to this in Christmases to come. So give us the sales pitch on that, and let us know when it's out.
I like the idea of doing a sales pitch. Well, it was. It's had a few different lives, this book, and it settled on television and repetition. And it's really because repetition is something that has quite negative connotations. It's the thing that we try and avoid, and I think we've managed to probably avoid it in our conversation today, I hope. But especially in relation to television, it's sort of the thing. Repeats on television are seen as something that people don't particularly like or welcome, yet we watch repeated content all the time on television. So I was interested in that, and interested in the way that television uses repetition as a thematic and aesthetic device. So how patterns of repetition create meaning within television texts, and how they can be used variously and differently in different examples. So it's finding different new words for repetition has been.
Well, I was thinking about repetition being able to save so many television programs that are almost tank, and then the repetition or the repeats save the show because people watch The Office again and go, oh yeah, I missed that the first. Only Fools and Horses is a very good example of that. Which maybe leads back to the Snowman as something, because I've managed to dodge it every year when it's been on television, but the repetition of that doesn't seem to alleviate its popularity. It sort of increases it, accelerates it.
Yeah, and it's kind of a benign repetition, isn't it? The Snowman. It's not intrusive. It doesn't feel like repetition because it's part of an annual cycle rather than, oh my God, they've shown this week after week after week, which I think is what people fear with repetition. And I think also it's because it comes at Christmas and it is sort of non-demanding in many respects, it's exactly what people probably want at Christmas, something that's not going to sort of require too much. I think that's why Only Fools and Horses and Gavin and Stacey and those kinds of sitcoms appeal at Christmas as well.
That's Christmas, isn't it? In a way, that's the most comforting aspect of Christmas, is you sort of know beat by beat how the day's going to go, and the next day after that, within a rough structure. And there's something very comforting about repetition. So it's good to be thinking about it in a slightly less than, that's a really interesting project, and look forward to reading it when it is out. With the risk of repeating myself, James, thanks again. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Chris, that's been us for another year of podcasts, I suppose. So we're going to take a very quick Christmas break, and we'll be back in mid-January. There will be one more footnote episode to come after this, with Chris and I discussing Christmas movies. What is a Christmas movie? How might you think critically about Christmas as a concept, as an idea, as an aesthetic? And then we'll take a quick break. So one more to come, and then we'll see you in the new year. Have a lovely holiday, we'll see
Merry
you next
Christmas.
time. Merry Christmas. I haven't done the admin, but we'll call it a Christmas treat. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.